Hi, thank you all very much for coming. This is my first time presenting at the Anarchist Book Fair. I'm very happy and very honored. There were some images that I wanted to go with introducing the piece, but I think that there are enough of us here, we can get a conversation going. My talk is called 20th Century Environmental Change, Colonialism and Fascism. And I came up with a subtitle, because I thought this morning I probably should write all this down someday, called Authority Under Pressure. And the premise that I'm operating on, and I'm not quite finished with, is that climate change, not even just climate change, environmental change, which is a much more broad way of encompassing what is happening to humanity's relationship with nature, is pushing many already active, present authoritarian forces in our world into states where they're much more calcified, much more virulent, and that we can draw connections between what's happening in what they call the quote-unquote natural world and how our political societies are going to form up as possibly more exclusive, more violent, more reliant on the state as a form of organizing civic, social, legal, and economic life. Now, had things gone the way I planned, there'd be images behind me right now. The first image would be the breaking up of the western half of the Antarctic ice pack that NASA just confirmed last week is inevitable, it's happening, and it's going to change the coastline globally. 10 feet more water. And that means a lot if you're living, say, in Bangladesh, which is currently being heavily inundated with seawater, cyclones. People need to move. And that brings us into conversation with something that is going to happen on Tuesday. In India, a man by the name of Narendra Modi is going to become Prime Minister. I can already see some faces in the audience. He's accused of playing a crucial role in the massacre of 790 Muslims in the state of Gujarat, where he was chief minister in 2002. Modi represents a revived BJP, which is a Hindu nationalist formation in India. He's very friendly with the business community. They're very happy to see him come in. And, it's frightening for a lot of people, especially when we're thinking about, a country like Bangladesh, which is called in some places one of the LDCs, least developed countries, surrounded on three sides by India, and one of the most ambitious border patrol projects is being initiated in that space. Massive razor wire fence that is not only patrolled on both sides by border guards, but also a voluntary association of people on the ground. And that is going to open up another conversation we can have about right-wing formations in South Asia. On December 12th of last year, Israel began transferring 500 African migrants to an all-purpose jail in the Negev desert. Those detained can be held indefinitely. Now, it's very difficult to distinguish whether someone has moved or migrated or become an asylum seeker or a refugee purely for environmental reasons. In fact, there's no purely for. The environment is in everything. It's in labor, it's in the way we organize society. And why this is frightening is because, one, people are moving not only because of, and I hate this phrase, regional instability. They use it to describe the African continent often, and it takes away a lot of history. Takes away the idea that we could associate this with, Western imperialism, capitalist exploitation. And much of that has culminated in what is called the North's ecological debt. The 400 parts per million, roughly what we hover around, that is raising temperatures, is mainly due to our consumption in the North.
Not China?
China's opening up.
China's what?
China's also participating. I'm not ideologically committed.
I hope not.
No, not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. I mean,
people usually ignore that. Many people usually.
I would say maybe in the United States.
But historically, while China has now reached the same levels as the U.S., the U.S. still is responsible historically for the great portion.
Yeah, well, I was just talking about, I mean, the skies over Shanghai are black.
Sure, but that's
they've been plunging
absolutely,
years, okay?
Absolutely, sir. But at the same time, there is a historical burden that, that kind of argument, and it's not untrue, but that when you play that card, it no longer becomes the North's problem. And I think that I'm also, one of the things I want to address is that these geographies, developed world, underdeveloped world, third world, first world, they're here. They're not going anywhere, but the world is changing.
I agree.
Anyway, and speaking of a changing world, one of the things that's very frightening about the movement of African folks into Israel through the Sinai Desert into South Tel Aviv is that there has been participation on the part of the Israeli military and companies in going into Sudan, for example, as weapons contractors, as military trainers, as suppliers of unsalted, desalinated water. And moving on, here's a gem. What will be the reaction of white Christian Europeans faced with this influx of starving and ignorant Africans? We don't know if Europe will remain an advanced united continent or if it will be destroyed, as happened with the barbarian invasions. Anyone want to take a guess?
That's a big issue in Italy. I can tell you that. That's a news story every day. We're losing our country because people arrive from Lampedusa, which is just part of Sicily. It's just a little island there, and they don't know what to do with all these people because there's very little employment anywhere because it's all in the north.
Yeah. I mean, that's another, a micro north-south divide. Mm-hmm. Northern Europe versus Southern Europe. It just so happens that the people further south often are more, more intimately confronting the brutality, more prone to enacting it. Do you want to take a guess at who said that? Anyone?
Could you repeat that statement?
I think it's good. Well, I'll go with it. That was Muammar Gaddafi. Former head.
He was very popular in Sicily.
Yeah, I can imagine. In Rome in 2010 at the Treaty of Friendship and Security. So Gaddafi, we'll go into a little bit of his relationship with Silvio Berlusconi's administration in a little bit, but we already see there is a north-south divide, but in order to maintain it, a lot of our post-colonial conflicts have lapsed into, this is an old story, being clients for the North. And here's a fun fact. Presently, the equivalent of 40% of Africa's arable land has been purchased by foreign buyers. That's not just land in Africa. This is what we're talking about, the whole landmass, transnationally, over the world. There's a huge international land grab. Much notable amongst the buyers are China, South Korea, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and India. Much of the land in Africa itself, however, is being leased not just for the purpose of growing food, but is also a response to the push for biofuels. These were critical purchases and leases to many of the above, especially India and China, because food prices spiked in 2008, sparking riots throughout the world. Here we have another quote. Neil Burtz, one of the most listened to talk show hosts in the United States, weighed in on immigration in 2006. We're sort of going back in time here. They are not going to be shipped back. I mean, think about it. Mexico doesn't want them back, first of all. Think what happens if we round up where we store 11 million Hispanics just waiting to ship them back to Nicaragua, Colombia, Costa Rica, Mexico. Where do we store them? The Superdome and the Astrodome in Houston. That's where we'll put them.
Who said that?
That was Neil Burtz. He's one of the nation's most popular shock jocks.
American guy?
Yeah. So, some people in this country are very vocally, I don't know, they approved of the government's handling of the post-Katrina crisis. And then our last trip back in time. Internal migration in China. In 1994, of approximately 120 million internally displaced people in China, at least 6 million qualified as migrating due to environmental factors. So, leaving off from there, I want to begin my presentation with some introductions that are personal and also outline how I approach the subjects I'll discuss and be discussing with you all today.
Would you mind quickly, because I didn't catch the connection, the upshot of the BJP's descendancy in India's relationship to your discussion?
I mean, I'll go into it a little bit more deeply, but what is concerning, at least to me, and I think for many other people, is that the BJP is also very heavily anti-immigrant.
Well,
very anti-political.
I understand.
What's the BGT?
BG.
It's the Hindu nationalist.
They're a Hindu nationalist right-wing party, but I wasn't clear if you had made it drawn a connection between their anti-Islamic and anti-immigrant politics and their ecological policies.
I mean, you don't need a direct correlation to have an ecologically driven fascism,
Well,
right?
I'm literally just asking what they are. I just don't know. I'm curious.
People leave Bangladesh for whatever reason, one of them being natural disasters, or if you believe in natural disasters, right?
Of course. Yeah, I'm not challenging you.
No, I'm not challenged. I'm trying to explain. If you believe in that, but I'm assuming that since a lot of us think that it's our relationship to nature through capitalism that produces these so-called disasters many of the times. Essentially, it's just a calcification of hardline sentiment. That has some nuances in it that I would parse out. I don't know personally if there's any statement about the environment.
I was trying to derail you. I was just enjoying this.
Yeah. Anyway, so
Just to add your quote, you think one of the things, as I understand it, that how he's sold this extremely right-wing, many people explicitly call it fascist, anti-Islamic Hindu nationalism, is to say, but look at what I'm doing for development in the economy, and look at these aspirations. So he wants to, this is his policy that he sells. He's like, okay, yeah, I'm anti-Muslim, I am right-wing fascist, but we're going to ease up land acquisitions for mining, for industry. This is he's trying to sell this as what India should become. And that's what, that's what's the positive thing, that people are overlooking the xenophobia and the genocidal tendencies because they're pro-development. That's the message.
Before I get to you, Giti, did you want to add something to that?
I just wanted to say that Modi, I think, also wants to deport population immigrants.
Yes, and he's gone on record saying they better have their bags packed once I get into office. And you,
Yeah, well, the other thing too is it's basically a populist belief, just like other populists use this, economic terms. And he's been saying toilets, not temples, just basically trying to tamp down. And it's kind of, if you look at it in the 30s with the rise of Nazism, and a lot of just people said, oh, well, all that Jewish stuff, that's just talk. He doesn't really mean it. And then, but Nazis, they built the roads, so there's this aspect to it.
And in terms of environmental, I mean, the environmental degradation on the subcontinent is all over, and that leads to economic stress. You have farmers committing suicide.
But quite a lot of that took place under Congress, who've been wiped out.
Well, yes, and this is also when people are looking, they see corruption, and then they're looking for a change, and there was any change.
Can I make a request that we do this after the
Yeah, I'm
presentation?
sorry.
I want to power through a little bit.
Yes.
I do like this taking breaks, but I also know that we only have an hour. Anyway, so with all of that said, I want to begin my presentation with some introductions that are personal and also outline how I approach the subjects I'll be discussing with you all today. I have been involved with some anti-war activism and Palestine solidarity work. But for the purposes of this talk, I would like to take the time to note that I am both a college student and an American national. Which means that I approach these issues from a specific angle, and I talk about them in a specific way, because we're coached both by our societies and the educational institutes through which we pass to talk about them in a certain way. And I think that, our various different points of view, how we came to that, will come through in the discussions that we'll have after we've gone through a few of the, general ideas, the more suggestions. And hopefully we'll come to a fruitful conversation. I think that it's not that I think that it's an invalid way I'm coming about. It's not a confession as much. It's only that I have an approach, and with that in mind, I also want to let you know that I'm going to speak with the intention of eventually, definitively stopping, so we can have a discussion. And I'm personally looking forward to learn how I might expand my capacity to relate or even think about these issues. So there were 4 key words that were important in this event's description. Colonialism and fascism were, they were in the title. But there are some words that I think are definitely worth unpacking, especially in the context of an anarchist book fair. And these are the state and capital. As words go in left-wing circles, these get used quite frequently. And I think it's important to clarify then what they should mean when we're using them to address these topics. Especially since this one encompasses something as dire as all life on the planet. Admittedly, this talk focuses the lens pretty sharply on human life. That's not to say that I believe the struggle is human-centered. But one objective of this talk is to demonstrate how deeply connected these issues are to race and nationality. The state is something that definitely subsumes both. This might seem obvious because the word is often associated with government and governing. Neither of those are simple in a conceptual or practical sense, though. The state is a combination of institutions that regulate and control life. This could be the day-to-day life of us coming together in this room, got a laptop running here, we use mass transit. The state has intervened in some ways to make all of this possible. And that all is predicated on a degree of resource extraction, energy use, and labor. People have to build this stuff too. It could be the day-to-day life, or it could be the life of a Senegalese migrant detained somewhere in the EU. The state has a hand in all of this, accommodating and serving, as well as confining and oppressing. States are said to have quote-unquote sovereignty, a term that's associated with drawing physical borders and determining what happens to those who live inside, whether they're allowed to be there or not. Everyone within that geographic space must be subject to some form of control. Being outside of that control supposedly threatens the integrity of the state, at least theoretically. This is why Gaddafi's remarks, as the dictator of a former Italian colony, despite their being racist and abominable, are so prescient. It's vital to the state's capacity to exercise sovereignty is the maintenance of borders. They're containers, which is why the regimes of Gaddafi and the Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi had a common interest. Up until his overthrow, Gaddafi would violently discourage migration across the Mediterranean and into the EU. For this, he would receive a payoff of $5 billion annually and weapons with which to suppress dissent. Now moving on to capital, which could be associated with money, accumulated wealth. This is half true, but for the purposes of the talk, I want to emphasize that capital is also related to the capacity to move and accumulate resources or wealth. The massive land grab I described earlier, which is not contained to Africa, is a perfect example. These powerful buyers are also looking to the Philippines, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Also consider shipping and fossil fuel extraction. These are all changing as things heat up. Shipping lanes are opening up, ice melts, so it's not only, which is crucial because it's not only about accumulating wealth, but moving it around so you can reinvest it, do whatever. And presently, the amount of carbon dioxide released hovers around 400 parts per million. We all know this, which is set to push, push temperatures up by over 2% degrees Celsius and beyond, which produces the drying and deluge effects that I am claiming, I think is understood affect migration. They also are productive for capitalists who see new markets opening and also see the prices of commodities that we already need, water and food, appreciating. And this brings us to colonialism, which represents investment to those powers that practice it. In the 19th century, definitely, this was very much about expanding and maintaining, expanding sovereignty, incorporating new countries in. And there are still examples of this today, of course. I mean, take the land that we're on now. We're on an active settler colony that also operates as the center of an empire. Then we have the EU's border vigil, making sure that Africans don't cross over. Russia with respect to Ukraine, China with respect to Tibet, Israel's 60-year occupation of Palestine, and the United States' control of the Mexican economy through NAFTA. Today's colonialism, however, seems to emphasize the money side of the term investment. Vestiges of the civilizing mission of 19th century colonialism still exist in aid agencies, humanitarian assistance, and the U.S. maintains a military presence to make its interventions. That's how it will be a world leader from here on out. It's no longer the economic powerhouse it used to be. The main concern for outside powers, however, is buying land, not ruling it. Though this is done quietly and largely under the radar of the mainstream media, this is a territorial shift that has not been seen, arguably, since the 19th century. And what connects colonialism to fascism is that it propels both those who have been forced from home in the global south with disenfranchised people leaving in the quote-unquote receiving countries. Fascism is grassroots participation in maintaining the state's sovereignty. Whether through electoral demagoguery, as we've been discussed a little bit, or bloody street violence, fascists work to directly galvanize their communities against supposed outsiders. Due to the direct use of violence on the part of these fascists, it's not uncommon for them to be either in direct confrontation with the state, or in some uneasy, though probably enthusiastic agreement with it.
Like Greece.
Yeah, I'll get there. There are fascists who take power, who have connections to prestige, privilege, and wealth. Then there are those in the streets who have different motivations. Both are connected by a rhetoric of national identity. But that, however, is only what steers a fascist movement. It doesn't explain where they get the momentum or the political will to police borders or commit programs. the foot soldiers of fascism are often motivated by a scarcity ideology that becomes frighteningly relevant when we think about contracting space on a global scale. So capitalists see endless opportunities to speculate. Those of us, on the ground, many of us see, and you'll see this when when discussing how the Bangladesh-India border is patrolled on the Assam side. People literally say climate change. Bangladesh is flooding, and it's their problem. How do they, even the generous arguments are, how do they expect us to do anything about it? And then there's the darker side. The European sentiment that Gaddafi echoes, or is actually part of, and then Golden Dawn. Now that we've gotten through that, I think I can skip through my concluding, we'll look at some of these borders, and we'll then segue to the conversation that I think everyone is itching to get in on.
Can we interrupt just for
Yeah.
a moment? So it turns out the adapter only works for a...
So there's a PC.
Yeah, for a PC.
You have an Apple, that's why.
Can we open up whatever you...
For any direct reason. It's just been sort of a random as I've been getting more acquainted with the subject. I'm looking at the US-Mexico border, obviously India, Bangladesh. Then I wanted to bring in Israel, Palestine, Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, whoever else is there. The EU. Not just the EU, but specifically the Mediterranean region, because I don't think that the race riots that we've seen in South Tel Aviv, where the target has been African migrants by Arab Jews, has it's not isolated to the eastern to Israel. It's a Mediterranean phenomenon. And it comes with historical baggage, right? In the sense that, one, Israel has been, Israel's settler colonial relationship to the land of occupied Palestine only begins officially in 1948. Back in 1901, you already have European Zionist forces sending people to have a directly ecological relationship with the land and make it ready for settlement. This is called the Jewish National Fund, and they go back as far as 1901. They import a lot of plant life that isn't localized to the region. It makes it difficult eventually for Palestinians to farm. The real conflict around the capacity to have a relationship with the land is one. We've heard, a lot of us have heard stories about Israeli waste management flooding into, Palestinian villagers from settlements. The other thing is desalination, making fresh water out of salt water. Israel has a history of over-consuming its natural aquifers, which makes it challenging to maintain an ongoing desert occupation where on the Arab side you have desert and on the non-Arab side you have grass. But this goes beyond this. Sudan, where many of the people who are getting attacked in the capital are from, refugees of the split between South Sudan and South Sudan. South Sudan has already opened up agreements, discussions with Israeli companies about water rights. See, the privatization of water services is something that the World Bank has historically defended. This is an opportunity to extend a colonial channel into Africa. We can make the desert bloom is the motto, right? So in a weird way, or not in a weird way, there's a kind of push and pull. Push the immigrants out, but also reinforce the conditions that make them come over. And have them deal with, a minority that's sort of in between Arab and favored population, that suffers economic discrimination, that's trapped in the welfare system, and in one way or another is subjectivated into becoming a right-wing force. Greece, I'd argue, has similar history in terms of recent austerity measures. And the fact that this country's military, which is already a very devastating ecological force, has displaced so many people from Iraq and Afghanistan that now have to, that have now found their way there, and are caught between austerity, lack of housing, and angry people who are looking for an outlet. And it's not localized to Greece, because Greece isn't the only one that does the border patrolling of the Mediterranean. Spain, Malta, Italy, Greece, and then infighting between the two. Malta and Italy, Italy doesn't want to shoulder the burden of dealing with people, so it transfers it to Malta, which is a smaller country, less land, and if you are picked up in Malta, coming over on a raft or a boat, you're detained for 18 months in open-air detention facilities that are dotting the Mediterranean region now. Hopefully when we get a passcode in...
It'll function.
It'll function. Oh, is it? Are we ready? I can show you some images, and hopefully that can. We don't need that to provoke discussion. I think I've spoken enough. Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned before that fascism is about reinforcing a national identity, but then I noticed the Free Palestine sticker. So I'm just wondering, do you think that having a national identity is harmful to an anti-authoritarian movement?
Not necessarily. I mean, if this is, as I described earlier, colonized land, settler colonized land, indigenous people have a right to their identities. I think there's a distinction that needs to be made about like right-wing nationalities, or right-wing nationalist movements and left-wing, or even if you want to use that binary, some people might not want it. What is the struggle for national self-determination versus rechanneling your frustration at austerity? I think there's a difference. Yeah.
I want to build on what this lady said a few minutes ago about maybe it's the sociology of fascism. Also relates to what he says is that the term right wing can be confusing because it can talk about Barry Goldwater style thing. But one of the things that distinguishes fascism within the right wing thing is that fascism comes on the left. People tend to forget that Adolf Hitler campaigned as a socialist, as a national socialist, okay? And that is part of the whole dynamic of fascism. It's a very populist thing. Golden Dawn being a classic case example. They hand out bread in the streets, preach to the poor, etc. And it's something that in an economic
and national identity play out. I'm not saying the two are the same at all.
I didn't see.
No. But it's more the sense that, like, look, when I read about Modi's past where he was an official in charge in Gujarat, and like these riots broke out, and they're bloody and they're horrible. Do I think is this the French national? Is this a French national formation or is this the German one? Right? I know, what you're trying to do is a very rigorous logical thing, right? But we have to find the logic in the chaos as the context unfolds, right?
Well, of course, but if fascism is a European category, just
is it a European category? Who said it was a European category? Yeah.
One country which has been omitted but is also at the center of climate change is Nepal. And Nepal just had a civil war. A third of their population are migrant workers, maybe more.
Going to the Gulf.
Also just previously had a Hindu state, and it was a monarchist state, and it is sandwiched in between India and China, and everybody wants their hands because it's so rich in natural resources. And what's going on there is really a horror show. I think that this is also, you can look at this too, especially with Modi's acceptance as well, because you can say that the Chinese government is a fascist state, and you can also say now that with the rise of the BJP, and also the fact that the BJP has been very upset with the fact that the monarchy ended in Nepal, and they are also wanting to have that political change to reaffirm Nepal as a Hindu state. And what this means for the rest of the world, as Nepal is the rooftop of the world. So.
I mean, that's not something I'm particularly knowledgeable about.
And one little story from when I was in Nepal, and the whole notion of climate change. I was staying with a family. They'd never been outside of Pokhara, very, very, very provincial, and they were middle class because they had screens on the windows, and so this huge roach came scurrying across, and was enormous, and he said, roaches like that never came into the village. They were always in the jungle, but now the jungle is disappearing, as are the glaciers, and are the glaciers in New York disappearing too? And so here's somebody who has, we have denialists all over the place, and here's somebody asking, knowing what is going on. And so I think that is also it's a very localized piece of the puzzle, but everything is local to a certain extent.
Well, I mean, and also denialism can also be, it's everywhere, but kind of strangely local. Like one of the points that I don't think I developed too well is that the people who are directly responsible for making the decisions, the heads of corporations, the heads of banks, the people who sit at the boardroom, they know this is happening. They see a market opportunity. They do know that this is happening, but there's a kind of magical thinking. It's not going to happen now. I would rather have $5 now than $10 in sustainable livelihood later.
Well, that's not how China works. I mean, they operate on investment models which don't require an immediate capital return on investment, which is why they can throw millions of dollars into developing solar panels in a way that American corporations legally are prohibited from doing, because they can just keep eating the waste in terms of their U.S. trade deficit with their exports, right? So I'm just saying.
What's the point?
And I'm not just trying to be persnickety. I'm saying that there are modalities to the way that various authoritarian states.
I don't see that as persnickety, and I wasn't trying to do an anatomy of every authoritarian state from just more this phenomenon. And I take your point. BP, and I would like to, what do people think about what's been said?
Well, one thing that I was thinking about is also
Just speak up a little bit.
Sure. I was also thinking that oil companies are funding right-wing parties, so that's another thing to keep in mind when we're talking about literally the flow of capital.
Yeah.
And the other thing is that there's something about this border politics that is very intimately tied to a particular model of ownership of land, right? And it's a model of ownership of land that perpetually displaces the impact that practices on land have. So that it is
ownership of land, I hear development coming out of that as a conversation. China likes to talk about development now. We all like to talk about development.
Well, I'm thinking about development, but I'm also thinking about the politics of indigenous struggle.
Yeah, which I wanted to include, but also it started getting sprawling. So anyone who's not me. Anyone who's not me to start a conversation.
Well, I was thinking when you were talking before about, you said that Gaddafi got all of this money from Italy.
Yeah.
And I just wondered, the Italian people have any say in that, or did this come from private corporations that gave this money to Gaddafi? How was that decision made from the state?
I've got a bunch of different sources on that. Some that I don't trust as much as others. I know that this happened. One source I read said that Silvio Berlusconi directly told Muammar Gaddafi how to invest in Italy, and gave him a specific plan. I got that from, a newspaper that I don't regularly read, so I don't know how much I believe, but I don't know.
That makes a lot of sense.
How are we for time?
We have 5 minutes.
5 minutes?
I was going to Vijay Prashad's book, Arab Spring, Libyan Winter.
Can I push another book? Which is Carbon Democracy by Tim Mitchell.
Okay.
And it's a must-read because it's talking exactly about political development, colonialism, and basically the growth of democracy as linked to the fossil fuel industry and how the two are joined together.
And Lita.
I'd love to hear from someone who has not spoken at all
Yeah.
yet about what brought them to this workshop and like what are the concerns that are pushing you to spaces like this.
Can we hear the question again?
So I would like to hear from anybody who has not spoken at all about like why they're here and just like what are the concerns that are pushing you to spaces like this, because I think that there's probably like a really rich history in all of our individual stories that make us concerned about this issue that are probably related to fascism and colonialism as well as empire building. So yeah, like if anybody wanted to share that, I'm interested in that.
Southwest, I didn't go out.
I don't know if there's anyone else who wants to say.
Go ahead. I mean, you haven't spoken yet.
I had something to say, but it wasn't exactly about them. But I mean, one thing that I think is pressing, and I want to kind of push about this question about the relationship between race and nation, is that borders are also racializing, and that borders produce difference. Like, so, I mean, one thing that was striking for me, like, I'm Greek American, but when I went back to Greece, like, realizing that people in Greece can look at someone and tell you if they're Greek or Albanian, and I can't because I didn't grow up there. And so the ways that people read bodies, the ways that people get interpolated into these different kind of national configurations is very contextual and is produced by borders. And one thing that's happening is, I think, with this question of imperialism, is that also on the periphery, the West becomes an alibi. Because people will say, in Greece will say, like, well, we weren't a colonial power, therefore it's not our fault, therefore we don't have any, we're being scapegoated. And I think that has to do with the sort of geographical configurations that are happening here. I'm sorry, that wasn't totally answering my question.
Anyone else want to explain what brings them to a talk like this? Someone who hasn't spoken. Anyone who hasn't spoken?
It's not really why I came to this talk. I'm from England, you might have heard of my accent. But there's a whole new sort of can of worms when you look into the EU and the border policies across the EU, and this idea of an external EU border, which is guarded partly by Frontex, which is a common border force. And then a set of regulations within the EU of the movement of migrants from the outside of the EU within it. And I don't know how much to say, but it's just going to open up a whole set of complexities that we can't discuss here. but this idea of a common border, which is protecting a set of nations who are essentially competing against each other, or who each want the next country along to take the migrants and not them. So this whole other complex set of dynamics, which one way of playing out at the moment is a political party in the UK called UKIP, the UK Independence Party. They were, I'd call them far right, they deny it. But they're playing this very interesting game of trying to convince the world that they're not racist, and they've got Indian and Pakistani politicians standing as candidates for the European Parliament, which they're against the European Parliament. But playing on sort of racial hatred, but specifically against Eastern European.
I think we need to start wrapping things up.
Yeah, no. So, yeah, sorry.
Right. Well, thank you all so much.